Welcome to Life Stories, where we explore the journey of self-discovery, growth, and the lessons life has to offer. Today's story follows Jake, a man caught between ambition and the deep human connections that shape our existence. Join us as we delve into his transformative journey, where each decision, each encounter, teaches him more about the true meaning of success. Get ready to reflect, learn, and be inspired by the story of a man who discovers that the greatest wealth is not what we accumulate, but the bonds we create. Subscribe now to begin today's story. The streets of Chicago were particularly unforgiving in winter. The wind whipped through the alleyways, carrying a bitter chill that made even the thickest coats feel inadequate. For Jake, a 10-year-old boy with tousled brown hair and oversized eyes filled with sadness, the cold was a constant companion. His thin, tattered coat did little to shield him from the biting frost. He sat huddled near the corner of a bustling bakery, his knees pulled to his chest and his hands stuffed into his pockets in a desperate attempt to find warmth. Jake's life had been a series of endless days and restless nights on the streets. The clamor of the city was his lullaby, and the hard pavement served as his bed. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, a relentless reminder of his precarious existence. Yet, despite his hardships, Jake carried a resilience that belied his years. His face, often smudged with dirt, held a quiet dignity that seemed to defy the world around him. As the bakery door swung open, the rich aroma of freshly baked bread wafted out, teasing Jake's empty stomach. He could almost taste the warm rolls, the butter melting into their golden crusts. But the warmth was just another thing he could only imagine. Jake kept his gaze low, avoiding the disapproving stares of passers-by who pretended not to see him. To them, he was an inconvenience, a blemish on their morning routines. A woman in a sleek blue coat stopped abruptly in front of him. Her piercing eyes, framed by perfectly arched brows, bore down on Jake with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. She crossed her arms, her polished leather gloves creaking slightly. "You're awfully young to be sitting out here like this," she said, her voice sharp and unfeeling. "Why don't you go find a job instead of begging for handouts?" Jake looked up, his big brown eyes meeting hers. His voice, though soft, carried a quiet strength. "I'd work if someone gave me a chance," he said, his words laced with desperation but also determination. The woman's lips curled into a cold smile. "A chance? Do you think the world hands out opportunities to people who don't work for them? You're nothing but a nuisance." Jake clenched his fists in his pockets, his nails biting into his skin to keep from crying. "I don't want pity," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "I just want a piece of bread so I don't faint." A small crowd began to gather, their interest piqued by the confrontation. A man in a heavy coat chuckled darkly and leaned closer to Jake. "Listen to him," the man sneered. "This kid thinks the world owes him something. What a cheeky little beggar." The laughter that followed felt like knives against Jake's already fragile heart. Tears pricked his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. "Cheeky is walking past me every day and pretending I'm invisible," he retorted, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. The man's face darkened, and he stepped closer, his boots splashing in the slushy pavement. "You're just a burden on this city," he barked. "Kids like you don't deserve anything but contempt." Jake flinched as the man's words struck deep, but he forced himself to speak, his voice now barely a whisper. "I didn't ask to be here. If I could, I'd disappear and leave you all in peace." The woman in the blue coat huffed and turned to address the crowd. "Someone needs to do something about these vagrants," she said loudly, as though Jake wasn't even there. "They dirty the streets and embarrass this city." An elderly woman carrying a bag of groceries stopped and nodded in agreement. "She's right. They're like rats, always scurrying around." Rats. The word echoed in Jake's mind, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. His tears finally spilled over, leaving wet tracks on his dirt-streaked face. "I'm not a rat," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm just a hungry boy." The crowd murmured in response, some shaking their heads, others exchanging judgmental looks. The man who had mocked Jake earlier stepped forward again, this time nudging the boy with his boot just hard enough to make him stumble. Have some shame, kid, he said cruelly. Jake fell to the icy pavement, his elbow scraping against the rough ground. Pain shot up his arm, but he bit his lip to keep from crying out. I lost my shame a long time ago, he thought, his gaze fixed on the grey clouds above. Slowly, he got back up, his small frame trembling from the cold and the weight of the insults. The first raindrops began to fall, cold and unforgiving. The crowd dispersed quickly, shielding themselves with umbrellas and hoods. The woman in the blue coat spat on the ground near Jake before walking away. I hope this rain washes you off these streets, she said, her words lingering like a curse. Alone in the downpour, Jake finally let his tears flow freely. The rain mingled with his sobs, masking the sound of his despair. Will anyone ever see me for who I really am? He whispered to himself, his voice lost in the howling wind. His body, weak from hunger and cold, refused to move. He slumped against the wall, his head resting on his knees. The world blurred around him, and the voices of the city faded into silence. As his vision dimmed, Jake had one final thought. If someone finds me, let it be before it's too late. When Jake opened his eyes, he was greeted by the dim light of a street lamp and the blurry silhouette of a girl holding an umbrella. Her brown hair was tied in a neat ponytail, and her school uniform clung to her small frame, damp from the rain. Her eyes, curious and kind, searched his face. Hey, are you okay? She asked, her voice cutting through the fog in Jake's mind. Jake tried to respond, but his throat felt raw, and the words wouldn't come. The girl took a step closer, concern evident in her expression. Before he could reply, a stern voice interrupted. Emily, step away from him. A woman in a tailored coat appeared, her expression as cold as the wind. She grabbed the girl's arm and pulled her back. You don't talk to boys like that. But Mom, he's just a kid. Emily protested, her eyes darting back to Jake. The woman didn't budge. People like him don't deserve your sympathy, she snapped before dragging Emily away. Jake watched them go, his heart sinking further into despair. Yet, amidst the pain, a flicker of warmth remained. Emily had seen him. She had asked if he was okay. And for a moment, Jake dared to hope that someone, somewhere, cared. The rain hadn't stopped, and Jake's body felt like it was made of lead as he tried to move. His limbs protested with every attempt, weighed down by exhaustion and the relentless cold. The streetlights above cast faint, flickering halos on the wet pavement, creating an otherworldly glow. Jake's head rested against the wall as he tried to will himself to stay awake. His stomach growled loudly, a harsh reminder of his hunger. He clutched at his thin coat, trying to suppress the shivering. Through the rhythmic drumming of the rain, he heard the soft hum of an engine. A sleek black car slowly rolled to a stop at the curb just a few feet away from him. Jake's eyes drifted to the vehicle, his thoughts sluggish. He watched as a well-dressed driver stepped out, hurrying to open the back door. An elderly man with neatly combed silver hair and a dignified air was helped into a wheelchair. The man's expression was one of quiet focus, his sharp eyes scanning the rain-soaked street. The driver moved quickly to gather the man's belongings, and in his haste, a black leather briefcase slipped from his hands, hitting the ground with a dull thud. Jake's gaze locked onto it immediately. Something about the briefcase called to him, though he wasn't entirely sure why. For a moment, Jake hesitated. He could barely muster the energy to stand, but his curiosity urged him forward. The driver seemed preoccupied, busy maneuvering the wheelchair toward the car. Jake pulled himself to his feet, his legs trembling under his weight, and shuffled toward the fallen briefcase. The lid had popped open slightly, revealing a glimpse of its contents. His breath caught in his throat when he saw the neat stacks of cash inside. bundled tightly and gleaming under the pale streetlights. His mind raced. This could change everything. He could finally escape the streets, eat as much as he wanted, and never feel the ache of hunger again. The temptation was overwhelming. But then, like a whisper from a distant memory, he heard his mother's voice. Always be honest, Jake. No matter what. His trembling hand stopped just short of grabbing the briefcase. The weight of her words felt heavier than the world around him. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, the cold rain seeping deeper into his clothes as he stood frozen between two choices. The old man, now settled in the car, noticed Jake's movement and turned his head. His sharp eyes softened with curiosity as he saw the boy holding the briefcase. "Hey, kid," the man called out, his voice raspy but firm. "Did you pick that up for me?" Jake swallowed hard. His voice barely worked, but he managed to nod. "Yes, sir," he replied, his words quiet but clear. He stepped forward and held the briefcase out with trembling hands. "It's yours." The man's eyebrows lifted slightly, his expression one of surprise and mild disbelief. He took the briefcase from Jake and opened it to confirm its contents. The neat bundles of cash remained untouched. "You didn't open it?" the man asked, his voice laden with curiosity. Jake shook his head. I just saw it fall." The driver, now noticing the exchange, looked between Jake and his employer. "Sir, we should go. The weather's getting worse," he said, glancing nervously at the boy. But the old man wasn't ready to leave. His sharp eyes studied Jake carefully, taking in the boy's frail frame, soaked clothes, and shivering form. "What's your name, son?" he asked gently. "Jake," the boy replied, his voice barely audible. "Well, Jake," the man said, his tone softening, "you've just done something most people wouldn't. You returned something valuable without hesitation." He paused, his gaze lingering on Jake's hollow cheeks and too-thin coat. "Why did you do it? You could have walked away with it." Jake lowered his head, unsure how to respond. "My mom always told me to be honest," he said finally, his voice trembling. "She said it's important, no matter what." The old man's lips pressed together as if holding back an emotion he wasn't used to showing. "Where is your mother, Jake?" Jake's eyes filled with a sadness too deep for his age. She's gone. I don't have anyone anymore." The old man leaned back slightly in his wheelchair, letting the weight of Jake's words sink in. He took a deep breath, then turned to his driver. "Help him into the car." The driver looked surprised but didn't argue. Jake blinked, confused, as the man gestured for him to step forward. "Sir, I don't understand," Jake said cautiously. "You've earned a warm place to stay tonight." "Jake," the man replied firmly. "No arguments." Jake hesitated for a brief moment, but the warmth radiating from the car was too inviting to resist. The driver opened the door, and Jake climbed in carefully, his body still shivering. As the door closed, the man extended his hand. "I'm Mr. Sullivan," he said, "and you're coming home with me." For the first time in what felt like forever, Jake felt a spark of something he had nearly forgotten: hope. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but for now, he had shelter, warmth, and a kind gesture he would never forget. The car's interior was warm, a sharp contrast to the biting cold Jake had left behind on the streets. He could feel his body relaxing as the heater kicked in, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to close his eyes. Just for a moment. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the soft rustling of the rain outside calmed his racing thoughts. He was tired. Too tired to worry about what might come next. Jake had seen enough of the world to know that good things didn't happen to people like him. People who lived on the edge, who were barely hanging on by the thread of hope. But here he was, sitting in a plush leather seat, feeling the warmth seep into his bones, all because of a decision he had made on a whim, returning a briefcase instead of taking it. The old man, Mr. Sullivan, didn't say much more after Jake had gotten into the car. He simply observed, his eyes never leaving the boy's face as the car glided through the rain-soaked streets. Jake couldn't help but feel uncomfortable under the scrutiny. But he didn't have the energy to fill the silence. He let his head rest against the cool window, watching the blurred outlines of buildings pass by as they made their way through the city. The car eventually slowed, turning into a large gated driveway. The iron gates creaked open as they approached, revealing a sprawling estate nestled behind tall trees. The house was grand, with a classic architectural style, stone walls, arched windows, and a sweeping front porch lit by soft lights. It looked like something out of a movie, the kind of place that was so far removed from Jake's reality that it almost felt surreal. The car came to a stop in front of the entrance, and the driver quickly moved to open the door. Jake hesitated for a moment before stepping out, his legs still unsteady. Mr. Sullivan, who had remained silent during the entire drive, now spoke. "You've been through a lot, Jake," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "I know life on the streets doesn't give you much in the way of kindness. But here you'll be treated differently." Jake looked up at the older man, his face still clouded with doubt. "I don't get it," he muttered. "Why are you helping me?" Mr. Sullivan studied Jake for a long moment, as if weighing his response. Then, he smiled a small, almost imperceptible smile. But it was enough to soften the lines of his face. "Sometimes, life just asks you to help someone. That's all." Jake didn't know what to say to that. What Mr. Sullivan had done was extraordinary, but it didn't make sense. People like him didn't get help from people like Mr. Sullivan. They were supposed to be invisible, forgotten, left to survive on their own. As they walked up the steps and entered the house, the warmth inside enveloped Jake completely. The foyer was grand, with dark wood floors and an expansive chandelier hanging above. A few paintings decorated the walls, and the scent of something sweet wafted from somewhere deeper in the house. It was as though he had entered a different world entirely, one where he didn't belong. Yet somehow, at that moment, it felt like he did. "Come, I'll show you to your room," Mr. Sullivan said, leading him down a long corridor. Jake followed behind, his footsteps echoing softly against the marble floors. He had never seen a place like this in person before. It was everything he had imagined luxury to be: refined, elegant, and distant from the world he had come from. The hallways were lined with expensive-looking furniture and soft, plush rugs. There was a quiet serenity in the air, a stark contrast to the chaos Jake had always known. Mr. Sullivan led him up a staircase to a guest room at the end of the hall. The door creaked slightly as he opened it, revealing a large room with a king-sized bed, a fireplace, and a sitting area by the window. Everything in the room spoke of comfort, luxury, and peace. A far cry from the cramped, noisy streets Jake had called home. "This is your room for as long as you need it," Mr. Sullivan said, stepping aside so Jake could enter. "You're free to rest, eat, or do whatever you like. I want you to feel at home here." Jake stood at the threshold, his gaze fixed on the room as if it might disappear the moment he stepped inside. He felt a lump form in his throat. It was overwhelming, and he didn't know how to react. No one had ever treated him like this before. He had never had anyone offer him kindness. Not like this, not without wanting something in return. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice raw. Mr. Sullivan nodded, his expression softening. "You've earned it, Jake. You've earned more than you think." With that, he turned and left, the door closing softly behind him. Jake stood there for a long moment, taking in the room around him. The bed looked inviting, but it wasn't sleep he was craving. It was peace, an end to the constant worry, the cold, the hunger. He felt a strange sense of disbelief, as though any moment, this kindness would evaporate and he would wake up back on the cold streets, where survival was a daily battle. But in that room, with its soft lighting and the warmth that surrounded him, Jake allowed himself a small, fragile hope. Maybe, just maybe, This was the beginning of something different. Something better. He wasn't sure yet what Mr. Sullivan saw in him, or why he was being given this second chance. But he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to waste it. For the first time in a long time, Jake allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by struggle and survival. It was only the beginning, but it felt like the start of something that could change his life forever. The following days passed slowly, almost like a dream. Each morning, Jake woke up to the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the soft hum of the house around him. Mr. Sullivan had arranged for him to meet with various people, most of whom were employees of the estate: housekeepers, gardeners, security staff, none of them asking too many questions, but all offering a friendly smile and a nod when they saw him. It felt strange, being in a world where no one expected him to justify his existence. No one treated him like he was invisible, like he didn't matter. Despite the comfort of the room and the calm of the estate, Jake couldn't shake the gnawing feeling deep within him. He didn't belong here. This life, this luxury, it felt like a facade. A world that would eventually crumble once they realized he didn't deserve it. Mr. Sullivan had been kind. More kind than anyone had ever been to him. But there was still a part of Jake that feared the rug would be pulled out from under him. The old man's promise of a fresh start, of a chance at redemption, hung in the air like a question that had yet to be answered. One evening, as Jake was sitting on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky with shades of orange and pink, Mr. Sullivan approached him. The older man had always seemed composed, his demeanor calm and reassuring. But tonight there was something different about him, something heavier, as though the weight of unspoken words was pressing on him. "Jake," Mr. Sullivan began, his voice quieter than usual, "I've been thinking about something. About what you'll do next." Jake looked up, his heart beating a little faster. He wasn't sure what he expected, but the way Mr. Sullivan said it made him feel like the ground beneath him was shifting. I don't know," Jake replied honestly. "I'm still trying to figure that out." The older man nodded, as though he had expected that answer. He sat down beside Jake on the porch, his eyes scanning the horizon. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. But the silence was comfortable, not awkward. Jake felt the weight of the question, but he didn't feel pressured to answer right away. "You've been given an opportunity, Jake," Mr. Sullivan said, breaking the silence. "A chance to start over. But with that comes responsibility. I don't want you to think this is just about giving you a roof over your head and food to eat. There's more to it than that." Jake glanced at him, trying to understand. The old man had been generous, but this felt like something else, something deeper. "You don't owe me anything," Jake said quickly, his voice tinged with defensiveness. "I didn't ask for this. I just don't want to screw it up." Mr. Sullivan smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes but still carried a sense of understanding. "It's not about owing me anything, Jake. It's about what you do with the second chance you've been given. You can't change your past, but you can shape your future." Jake swallowed, his mind racing. The words made sense, but they also felt heavy, like a burden he wasn't sure he could carry. He had lived for so long in survival mode, focusing on just getting by from day to day, that the idea of building a future, of planning for something beyond the immediate moment, felt overwhelming. What did he have to offer? What did someone like him have to build a future on? "I don't know if I can," Jake murmured, more to himself than to Mr. Sullivan. "I don't know if I have what it takes." The older man looked at him for a long moment, as if considering how best to respond. Finally, he said, "The truth is, no one ever really knows if they can. Not until they try. But you won't get anywhere if you don't at least try." Jake nodded slowly, absorbing the words. They weren't easy to hear, but they resonated with him. He had spent so much of his life avoiding failure, keeping to himself, not allowing anyone to get too close, because he was terrified of falling short. But here, in this new world. Maybe he could try. Maybe he could risk failing and still find a way to move forward. What do I do first? Jake asked, his voice quieter now, as though the weight of the question was finally sinking in. Mr. Sullivan smiled again, this time with a sense of pride. The first step, Jake, is to stop seeing yourself as someone who doesn't deserve to be here. You belong here just as much as anyone else. The next step is to find what it is you want to do. What excites you? What makes you feel alive? Jake thought about it for a long time. He had never really allowed himself to dream, to think about what he might want out of life. It had always been about surviving, about getting by. But now, with the world stretching out before him, the question suddenly felt like an invitation to finally live. Not just exist. I don't know yet, Jake said quietly, but I'm willing to try. Mr. Sullivan's eyes softened, and he patted Jake's shoulder gently. That's all I ask. Try. And take it one step at a time. The road won't be easy, and there will be days when it feels like everything is against you. But you have a chance now. Don't waste it. The weight of those words sat heavily with Jake. But in a way, it felt good. He had a chance. He had an opportunity to build something. Even if he didn't know exactly what that something would be, he wasn't going to waste it. Not this time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the estate, Jake stood up, a new resolve settling in his chest. There was a long road ahead of him, one filled with uncertainty and challenges. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had the strength to walk it. And no matter how difficult the journey, he wouldn't be walking alone. Jake's first few days on the estate after his conversation with Mr. Sullivan were filled with quiet introspection. It wasn't easy to let go of the doubts that had shaped him for so long. Every time he walked through the manicured gardens or sat down for a meal in the grand dining room, a part of him felt like an intruder, someone who was playing at being part of this world but wasn't truly welcome. But there was also another part of him, a quieter, braver part, that tried to ignore that voice, that whisper of insecurity. This was his chance, and he needed to take it, no matter how strange it felt. One afternoon, after Mr. Sullivan had left for one of his regular trips into town, Jake decided to explore the estate a bit more. He had spent most of his time in the house or the gardens, but now he felt the pull of the surrounding woods, the dark green trees just beyond the grounds. It seemed like a good place to think, to be alone with his thoughts. The woods weren't far from the main house, and Jake had often admired them from the window, their dense canopy offering a sense of mystery and quiet solitude. As he walked beneath the tall trees, he felt the weight of the world start to lift, replaced by the calming embrace of nature. The air was fresh, the forest floor covered with soft moss, and every step he took seemed to quiet the noise in his mind. It wasn't until he reached a small clearing that he realized how much he had needed this moment of peace. He sat down on a large rock at the edge of the clearing, gazing up at the blue sky peeking through the branches. For the first time in days, his mind felt clear, uncluttered by the constant hum of anxiety and fear. It was almost as though the woods had absorbed all his worries, leaving him with a sense of stillness he hadn't known in years. But even here, alone, the thought that kept resurfacing was the same. What was he supposed to do with this new life? He had been given an opportunity, yes. But what if he wasted it? What if he let it slip through his fingers? The same way he had let so many chances slip away in the past. As he sat there, lost in thought, he heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. Startled, Jake stood up quickly, his instincts kicking in. He wasn't sure why, but he felt a moment of panic, as though someone had caught him in the act of being something he wasn't supposed to be, vulnerable, uncertain. But when the rustling grew louder and the figure emerged, he realized it was only a woman. She was tall, with long, dark hair and a look of quiet confidence that seemed to match the stillness of the forest around them. Her clothes were simple, jeans, a sweater, and sturdy boots, but there was an elegance to her. A grace that made her seem almost out of place in the rugged landscape. "Sorry to startle you," she said, offering him a warm smile. Her voice was smooth, calm, and oddly familiar, as though they had met before. Jake's heart skipped a beat. "It's fine. I just wasn't expecting anyone else out here." The woman nodded, stepping closer. "I come here often. I find it helps to clear my mind." Jake regarded her for a moment. There was something about her presence, something comforting yet unassuming, that made him feel like maybe he wasn't so alone in the world after all. She didn't seem to judge him. Didn't seem to see him the way he sometimes saw himself, as an outsider. Someone who didn't quite belong. "I'm Jake," he said, offering a tentative smile. "I know," she replied easily. "Mr. Sullivan mentioned you." Jake's brow furrowed in surprise. "He did?" She laughed softly. "Not in a way you might think. He's just been curious about how you're adjusting to everything." Jake wasn't sure how to respond to that. He wasn't used to people, especially strangers, talking about him behind his back. It made him feel exposed. But there was something about the way she said it that didn't feel invasive. It felt like a reminder that he wasn't just a charity case here. There was a life waiting to be built. "I'm still figuring things out," Jake admitted. "It's a lot. You know? I've never had this kind of stability before." The woman's expression softened. "I can imagine. It's a lot of change all at once. But change can be a good thing. I'm Emily. By the way." "Emily," Jake repeated the name, rolling it on his tongue like it was something important. There was a certain quiet strength in her eyes, a calmness that put him at ease, even as the weight of his own insecurities began to rise again. "So, what brings you out here?" Emily asked, her tone still light. But there was an underlying curiosity there, an unspoken invitation to share. Jake hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether he wanted to delve into his thoughts. But something about the way she stood there, as though waiting for him to speak at his own pace, encouraged him to open up. "I don't know," he finally said. "It's just, all of this is new to me. And I'm not sure if I'm ready for it. Sometimes it feels like I'm living someone else's life. Like I'm pretending to be part of this world." Emily nodded, as though she understood exactly what he meant. "I think everyone feels like that at some point. Like they're an outsider. Or that they don't belong. But the truth is, Jake, we all have a place here. We just have to let ourselves be a part of it." The words hit him like a wave, deep and unrelenting. It wasn't that Emily had said anything groundbreaking, but in the simplicity of her statement, Jake felt something inside of him begin to shift. "Do you really think so?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I do," Emily said firmly. "But you have to believe it too." For the first time since arriving at the estate, Jake felt a spark of hope. Fragile but real. Maybe he wasn't as lost as he thought. Maybe he could belong here, after all. But the journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. He still had a long way to go before he could see himself in the way that Emily saw him, worthy, capable, and deserving of this new life. But as he stood there, looking at the woman who had so effortlessly shared her wisdom with him, Jake realized something. He didn't have to figure everything out all at once. He could take it one step at a time. And maybe, just maybe, he was already on his way. The days that followed his conversation with Emily were filled with small moments of self-reflection and quiet discovery. Jake started to see the estate through new eyes. Not as an unfamiliar world that he had stumbled into, but as a place that could be his. If only he allowed himself to belong. The lingering self-doubt, the fear that he was out of place, hadn't disappeared overnight. But something inside him had shifted. He was starting to see that there was a future here. A future that was his to create. Mr. Sullivan had returned to the estate a few days later, his usual commanding presence filling the halls once more. Jake noticed how the man moved through the rooms, always purposeful, always measured, as though he had been born to lead. There was no hesitance in him, no uncertainty, No second guessing. He had earned his place. Not by force, but by grace. It was a quality Jake couldn't ignore. One that seemed to shine through every action. Every word. Over breakfast one morning, Mr. Sullivan mentioned something that made Jake's stomach tighten. "I've been thinking." "Jake," Mr. Sullivan said, setting down his coffee with a deliberate hand. "You've had time to settle in now. It's time we put your skills to the test. I have a few projects that could use your attention." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The idea of being useful, of actually contributing to the estate in a meaningful way, was something he had longed for, but at the same time, the thought of failure, of letting down Mr. Sullivan, gnawed at him. "Of course," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What do you have in mind?" Mr. Sullivan's eyes gleamed with an intensity that Jake had come to recognize. "There are a few matters involving the estate's finances and some ongoing legal issues that need careful attention. It's nothing you can't handle. I trust you." Jake nodded, feeling a strange mix of excitement and fear. This was what he had wanted. To prove himself. To show that he was capable of more than just surviving. But now that the opportunity was in front of him, he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. "I'll need a few details," Jake said, his voice steady but his mind racing. "Could you give me a bit more information?" "Of course," Mr. Sullivan replied, his tone softening. "I'll have everything you need sent to your office. I expect you to be thorough. To think critically. There's no room for error." Jake swallowed hard. He had always prided himself on his ability to think critically, to approach problems from every angle. But the weight of Mr. Sullivan's expectations felt heavier than he had anticipated. That afternoon, Jake retreated to the office in the east wing of the estate. The room was large, with tall windows that overlooked the sprawling grounds. It was a space designed for focus, for long hours of contemplation. And Jake found himself oddly at home there. The walls, lined with books and old records, seemed to whisper the wisdom of those who had worked there before him. The documents Mr. Sullivan had promised were waiting for him, neatly arranged on the desk. They were a collection of reports, contracts, and letters all related to the legal matters and the financial health of the estate. Jake took a deep breath and began to sift through the papers, his eyes scanning each word carefully. As he worked, he found himself becoming more and more engrossed in the task. It was as though the weight of the papers, the weight of the responsibility, was somehow freeing. Each page he turned, each analysis he made, felt like a step closer to proving something to himself, to Mr. Sullivan, and to the world. But as the hours wore on, Jake's confidence began to waver. The complexity of the financial matters, the sheer magnitude of the decisions that needed to be made, was daunting. There were things here, loopholes, inconsistencies that he didn't understand fully. The fear that had been lying dormant in his chest began to stir again, whispering doubts that he had hoped he could silence. Was he really the right person for this job? What if he missed something crucial? Something that would put everything at risk? What if his inexperience betrayed him? A knock at the door broke his spiraling thoughts. "Jake." It was Emily's voice. "Can I come in?" Jake's heart lifted at the sound of her voice. He had become accustomed to the way she seemed to appear at just the right moments, offering quiet support when he needed it most. He looked up, relieved to see her standing in the doorway with a small, reassuring smile. "Of course," he said, standing up from his desk. She entered the room, her gaze flicking to the papers scattered across the desk. "Busy day?" "Yeah," Jake replied, running a hand through his hair. "I've got a lot on my plate. Mr. Sullivan wants me to go over some of the estate's legal and financial issues. It's a bit overwhelming." Emily walked over to the desk and looked down at the papers. "I can see that. It's a lot of responsibility." Jake sighed, feeling the weight of the task pressing down on him. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this. I've never done anything like this before. What if I mess it up?" Emily met his gaze. her expression calm but unwavering. "Jake, you've already proven you can handle more than you think. You have a sharp mind. And you know how to approach problems. You're just doubting yourself because it's new. But this is how you grow. You have to take risks, make mistakes, and learn from them. No one gets everything right on the first try." Jake looked at her, her words sinking in slowly. She was right. He had to trust himself. He had to believe that he was capable, that he was worthy of the opportunity Mr. Sullivan had given him. "You really think so?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I do," Emily said softly. "You just have to trust that you can handle it. Take it one step at a time." Jake nodded, feeling a new sense of clarity settle over him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would be times when he stumbled. But for the first time, he believed he had the strength to keep going. "I'll give it a try," Jake said with newfound resolve. Emily smiled, a quiet understanding passing between them. "That's all anyone can ask of you." As she left the room, Jake returned to his desk, a bit lighter, a bit surer of himself. He had a task ahead of him. Yes. But it wasn't a task to fear. It was an opportunity to rise. The next few days were a whirlwind of focus and hard work. Jake found himself immersed in the complexities of the estate's financial situation, poring over spreadsheets, legal contracts, and meeting with various advisors. It was daunting, no doubt, but there was something exhilarating about the challenge. Each problem he solved, each question he answered, added a layer of confidence he hadn't realized he was missing. He had started to understand the language of the estate, how it moved, how it breathed, and the more he understood, the more it felt like a puzzle he was slowly piecing together. The hours were long, often stretching late into the evening, but for the first time, Jake felt completely engaged, as if his work had purpose beyond just surviving in this strange new world. Mr. Sullivan, as expected, was a presence in the background, offering occasional guidance but mostly allowing Jake the space to find his own way. The older man was meticulous in his expectations, and Jake had learned quickly that anything less than complete attention to detail would be noticed. But Sullivan also had a way of letting Jake come to his own conclusions, offering the freedom to learn from his mistakes, something Jake deeply appreciated. On the fourth day, Jake had managed to uncover a serious issue in the estate's legal records. It wasn't anything catastrophic, but it was a mistake that, if left unchecked, could have cost the estate a significant sum of money. He had found a discrepancy in the land valuation reports that indicated the estate was being charged a much higher tax rate than it should have been. His heart raced as he double-checked the numbers. Everything lined up, this was real. When he presented his findings to Mr. Sullivan later that afternoon, the older man's reaction was far more subdued than Jake had expected. "Well done," Sullivan said, his voice calm but full of approval. "This could save us a considerable amount of money. I'll have my legal team follow up with the authorities. But this is a solid piece of work." Jake felt a rush of pride, but it was tempered by Sullivan's understated praise. It wasn't that the older man was ungrateful, rather, Sullivan had an air of measured reserve, one that made Jake feel like he was constantly walking on a razor's edge. Still, it was hard not to feel a quiet thrill of accomplishment. The validation, even in its subtle form, was enough. Later that evening, Emily found Jake on the estate's terrace, looking out over the sprawling grounds. It had become one of his favorite spots, a place where he could pause and reflect on the day's work. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the landscape, and Jake took a deep breath, enjoying the rare moment of peace. "You look like you've just solved the world's problems," Emily remarked, joining him on the terrace. Jake smiled, feeling the tension from the day melt away in her presence. "Well, I think I just solved a small part of them," he replied, his voice still carrying the excitement of his discovery. "There was an issue with the land tax valuation. I found an error in the reports. It's going to save the estate a lot of money." Emily raised an eyebrow. Impressed. That's incredible. Jake. You really pulled it off. It's nothing too fancy, he said, trying to downplay it. It's just. I don't know. I'm getting the hang of it. The more I dive into this, the more I realize it's just a matter of paying attention. Emily smiled warmly. You've always had an eye for the details. It's just a matter of applying it to the bigger picture. Jake turned to her, his gaze meeting hers. I wouldn't have been able to do it without your support, he said quietly. You've been a big part of why I'm even here. I've learned so much from you. She shook her head, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. I didn't do anything. You did all the work. I'm just glad I could help you see your own potential. Jake felt a rush of gratitude. Emily had been more than just a colleague to him, she had been a constant source of encouragement. A reminder that he wasn't alone in this. There were still moments when the doubts crept in, when the weight of his responsibilities felt too heavy. But Emily had a way of making him believe in himself, even when he struggled to do so. As the evening wore on, they sat together on the terrace, talking about everything and nothing at all. It was a comfort, a brief escape from the pressure that Jake had placed on himself. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he belonged not just at the estate, but in this world he was building for himself. The next few days saw the first concrete results of Jake's work. His legal findings were confirmed by the estate's legal team, and the tax authorities agreed to make the necessary adjustments. Sullivan had been right. Jake had uncovered something that could save the estate a significant amount of money, and his ability to handle the situation with professionalism had earned him more than just a passing nod of approval. But it wasn't just the money or the acknowledgement that mattered to Jake. What truly mattered was the shift he felt within himself. The fear that had once clouded his judgment, the uncertainty that had held him back, was starting to fade. In its place was a growing sense of self-assurance, of knowing that he was capable not just of surviving, but of thriving. It wasn't all smooth sailing. Of course. The pressure was still there. The expectations were still high. And Jake was still learning. But for the first time, he felt ready for the challenge. It wasn't about getting everything perfect, it was about putting in the effort, learning from mistakes, and knowing that he was worthy of the opportunity. Later that week, when Mr. Sullivan called him into his office for a follow-up meeting, Jake felt a familiar flutter of nerves. The man's serious demeanor made every conversation feel like a test. And Jake wasn't sure if he was ready for whatever Sullivan had in mind. Well done, Jake, Sullivan said as he closed the file on his desk, meeting Jake's eyes. Your work on the tax issue has saved us a considerable amount of money. You've proven yourself. But there's more ahead. This is just the beginning. Jake's heart pounded. But the words felt like a challenge, not a threat. I'm ready for whatever comes next, he said, his voice steady. Sullivan's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. Good. Because I'm going to need you for something bigger. For the first time, Jake wasn't scared. He was ready. Jake stood in front of the large oak desk in Mr. Sullivan's office, the older man's words still echoing in his mind. Something bigger. Those words were both exhilarating and intimidating. For the first time, Jake could feel the weight of Sullivan's expectations resting squarely on his shoulders. The praise had been validating, but the mention of something bigger stirred a mixture of excitement and apprehension deep within him. Sullivan leaned back in his chair, observing Jake with a steady gaze. He was the kind of person who made you feel like you were being measured for some unseen standard, one that didn't tolerate half-efforts or complacency. Jake had learned quickly that anything less than complete dedication would be noticed. But it was precisely that level of accountability that had helped him grow, even in the short time he'd been at the estate. You've done well so far, Sullivan continued, his tone both approving and expectant. But the financial oversight of this estate is only one piece of the puzzle. There are other aspects we need to focus on now. I need someone I can trust to handle more. Jake nodded, feeling his heart race. What do you mean? Sullivan paused, as if considering how best to explain. Finally, he spoke. His voice measured. The estate isn't just about numbers on a page. It's about relationships, partnerships, influence, reputation. What you've done so far is impressive. But I need you to start understanding the bigger picture. How we interact with the local government. How we manage the estate's investments. And how we build connections with other influential figures. These are the things that will determine our future success. Jake took a deep breath. This was a new level of responsibility. He had thought he was making progress in understanding the financial side of things. But now it seemed the true challenge lay in mastering the delicate web of human relationships and power dynamics that shaped the estate's success. You'll need to attend meetings with local officials. Build rapport with the heads of various industries that influence our work. And stay ahead of the competition. We need to be seen as leaders. Not just in terms of wealth, but in terms of influence. Sullivan's voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it that Jake couldn't ignore. Jake had always been more comfortable with numbers than with people. But this wasn't something he could shy away from. He had seen firsthand how Sullivan's presence commanded respect. How effortlessly he moved through rooms full of powerful individuals. It was something Jake admired but never quite understood. He knew now that it was time to learn. "I'll do whatever it takes," Jake said. His voice steady. "I'm ready." Sullivan studied him for a moment longer before nodding. "Good. You'll start by attending a meeting with some of the key figures from the local government. We have a property dispute on the horizon. And I need someone with a sharp mind to help me navigate it. You'll observe, take notes, and, if necessary, offer input." Jake felt a mixture of nerves and anticipation. A property dispute. This was real. It wasn't just paperwork or spreadsheets, it was the kind of challenge that required finesse, negotiation, and the kind of strategic thinking Jake had yet to fully develop. The following day, Jake found himself seated at a large, round table in a high-rise conference room, the air thick with tension. Mr. Sullivan was flanked by several of his colleagues, all of whom were seasoned professionals in real estate and business. Jake sat quietly at the far end, trying to absorb as much as he could from the proceedings. The meeting was with several local officials, representatives from the city planning department, and a few other stakeholders from the development sector. The topic at hand was a dispute over zoning regulations that had the potential to delay a major project the estate had invested in. It was a situation that, if not handled carefully, could cost the estate millions. Sullivan took charge of the room with his usual authority, speaking in a calm, measured tone that commanded attention. Jake watched intently as Sullivan navigated the conversation, carefully positioning his arguments and playing on the relationships he had built over years. He was smooth, almost too smooth, like a chess master orchestrating each move with precision. Every word was deliberate, every gesture purposeful. Jake's role in the meeting was to observe. But even as he absorbed the nuances of Sullivan's negotiation tactics, he felt the weight of the moment settle on him. He was no longer a mere bystander. He was learning from one of the best. And everything he observed, every word spoken, every look exchanged, was a lesson in power, persuasion, and leadership. As the meeting progressed, Jake began to notice something else. It wasn't just Sullivan's words or the logical flow of the arguments that were swaying the room, it was his presence. Sullivan knew how to command attention without raising his voice, how to make others feel like their ideas mattered. Even when he was firmly in control, Jake realized that this was a skill he would need to develop, a kind of subtle authority that came from understanding the dynamics of human nature. When the meeting finally ended, after a long and heated exchange, Sullivan turned to Jake. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice quieter now that the room had emptied. Jake hesitated, unsure of what to say. I think I have a lot to learn," he admitted. "But I also think you handled that very well. You seemed to know exactly when to push and when to back off." Sullivan nodded, pleased. That's part of it. Knowing when to fight and when to compromise is crucial. But it's also about reading people, knowing their motivations, their fears, what they're willing to lose. Every person in that room had something they wanted, and it was my job to make sure we got what we needed, without alienating them. Jake thought about Sullivan's words for a moment. It's more than just business. It's about understanding what drives people. Exactly, Sullivan said, a hint of approval in his voice. Business isn't just about numbers, it's about understanding the people behind those numbers. You can have the best financial plan in the world, but if you don't know how to connect with the people who matter, it won't get you far. Jake took a deep breath. He knew this was just the beginning. He had seen the importance of relationships, of connections, and of influence. Now, he had to learn how to wield them. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he was starting to see where it could lead. As he left the meeting room that day, Jake felt a surge of determination. The estate wasn't just a place, it was a world of its own. One that ran on power, persuasion, and subtlety. And Jake was ready to learn how to navigate it, one step at a time. Over the next few weeks, Jake threw himself into his new role with a determination that surprised even him. What had started as a desire to prove himself in numbers and finances was slowly morphing into an intricate game of relationships and strategy. Sullivan had given him the tools to understand the estate's power dynamics, but it was up to Jake to learn how to use them. His next challenge came quickly. There was a gala event that Sullivan insisted he attend. A gathering of local politicians, business magnates, and influencers. Sullivan had made it clear that this wasn't just an event, it was an opportunity. A platform to make connections that could shift the course of the estate's future. Jake, who had always preferred the quiet hum of spreadsheets to the noise of cocktail parties, was nervous. "You'll be representing us tonight," Sullivan had told him as they walked into the grand lobby of the event venue. "This is as much about appearance as it is about substance. Look confident, even if you're feeling anything but." Jake had spent hours in front of the mirror that afternoon, carefully selecting his suit and making sure everything was in order. Still, when he entered the ballroom, the vast space and the sea of unfamiliar faces made him feel out of place. He caught a glimpse of Sullivan, who was already surrounded by people. His smooth, authoritative voice effortlessly making waves in the conversation. Jake felt a pang of envy. How did he do it? How could he seem so at ease in a room full of strangers? For the first hour, Jake mostly stood at the edges, observing. He'd always been more comfortable listening than speaking. And tonight, that trait served him well. He watched Sullivan work the room. How he balanced compliments and challenges, flattery and sharp negotiation. It was like watching a conductor lead an orchestra, and everyone else in the room was merely following his lead. Jake soon noticed something: Sullivan was never alone for long. There was always someone with him, either seeking advice or offering something of value. It was clear that Sullivan wasn't just a figurehead, he was a trusted figure. Someone whose presence brought stability and confidence. As the night wore on, Sullivan caught Jake's eye from across the room and gave him a subtle nod. Jake took a deep breath and walked over. It was time to begin. "You're looking good tonight," Sullivan said, his voice light but purposeful. "You've been observing long enough. It's time to start making your mark." Jake nodded, though his stomach churned. He wasn't sure where to begin. Sullivan took a glass of champagne from a nearby server and handed it to Jake. "Start small," Sullivan suggested. "Introduce yourself. Ask questions. Get to know people. Not just their business interests, but what they want from the world. People respect authenticity, even if it's just for a moment." Jake gave a shaky smile and looked around the room, his eyes landing on a man standing near the window. He was dressed in a sharp tuxedo, his posture relaxed yet confident. And he seemed to be alone. Something about him struck Jake as someone who could be important. Someone worth connecting with. Taking Sullivan's advice, Jake approached the man. Good evening. Jake started, extending a hand. Jake Matthews. I don't believe we've met. The man smiled, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. No. I don't think we have. Richard Davis, he replied, shaking Jake's hand. What brings you to this fine gathering? I'm still getting my bearings. To be honest, Jake said, offering a self-deprecating smile. But I'm learning a lot. I hear you're involved with the local development projects. Richard's eyes lit up. That's right. I've been working on a few key initiatives downtown. You know how it is, things are always changing. And you have to stay ahead of the curve. Jake nodded, trying to follow along. But it was clear that Richard was more seasoned in these matters than he was. He didn't let it show, though, maintaining his composure. What's your interest in development? Richard asked, his tone suddenly more personal. Are you just observing tonight? Or do you have a stake in the game? Jake hesitated for a moment before responding. I'm here to learn. Mostly. I've been working with Sullivan at the estate. And I'm beginning to understand how much of this business isn't just about numbers, it's about relationships. About understanding what drives people. I want to learn how to navigate those dynamics. Richard seemed to appreciate the honesty in Jake's words. Sullivan. He said, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. He's a tough one to read. But he's sharp. If you're working with him, you're on the right path. But just remember, people like Sullivan know how to get what they want. You've got to be more than just a good listener. Jake took the advice in stride. Though it wasn't easy. As the night wore on, he found himself drifting from one conversation to another, always staying just one step behind in terms of depth and insight. The people around him were experts in their fields. But they were also more than that, they were masters of the art of connection. They knew how to leave a mark on others, how to create lasting impressions, even in brief encounters. Jake, on the other hand, felt as if he was just starting to scratch the surface. He could feel the importance of building relationships. But it wasn't natural for him. He couldn't help but wonder, what did it take to truly understand someone? To break past the layers of small talk and find the shared human connection that made it all worth it. By the end of the evening, Jake had spoken with a few other key figures. But it was clear that he had a long way to go. The gala had been a crash course in social dynamics. And he'd learned one important lesson: influence wasn't just about business knowledge. It was about understanding the people behind the deals. And knowing what motivated them. As Sullivan guided him out of the venue, Jake felt a mixture of exhaustion and clarity. There was so much more to learn. The gala had been a small glimpse into the larger world he was entering. But it had already begun to reshape how he viewed the world of business. Sullivan turned to him, a rare smile on his face. You did well tonight. You didn't rush things. And you listened. But next time, you'll need to lead the conversation. Remember, people want to feel like they're in control. You just need to let them believe they are. Jake nodded, already thinking of how he would approach his next opportunity. There was no turning back now. The world of relationships, of power and influence, was calling. And he was ready to answer. A few days after the gala, Jake found himself thinking about the conversations he'd had that night. There was something unsettling yet magnetic about the world he'd glimpsed, where every word had a weight. And every handshake carried a promise or a threat. It was a far cry from the quiet, methodical work he'd been used to in the office. As much as Sullivan had taught him about numbers, he realized that real power wasn't derived from the balance sheet. It was about control, the ability to influence. To predict how people would act. To understand their desires before they even spoke them. This kind of power wasn't something you could read in a book, it was something you had to feel in your bones. Jake hadn't yet fully grasped how much of it had already seeped into his own thoughts and actions. He was becoming more aware of how he carried himself. How he spoke. How others watched him. He could feel the shift within himself. That subtle transformation from a passive observer to a player in the game. The realization came slowly. But it was undeniable. Jake was changing. And though part of him resisted it, part of him reveled in it too. The pressure of the new role settled on him. Though, more than ever, he found himself at the intersection of business and personal relationships. Sullivan had insisted that Jake take the lead on a critical deal that had been pending for months, a massive real estate acquisition that could transform the estate's fortunes. This was the big one. It was also his first true test. Jake sat in his office one afternoon, reviewing the documents for the deal. His mind was racing, filled with figures, strategies, and potential pitfalls. It was all so logical, so predictable. But he kept hearing Sullivan's words in his head, "Don't just focus on the numbers. Jake, people move in ways you can't calculate. If you want to succeed, you have to think about what drives them." The words made him uneasy. How could he possibly know what drove someone? He had spent years studying equations, learning about systems and processes. People, however, weren't systems. They were unpredictable, complex. And Jake wasn't sure he wanted to understand them the way Sullivan did. Yet, as the deadline for the deal loomed closer, he found himself stepping further into that uncomfortable realm. He met with the sellers, a wealthy couple who had their own estate not far from the city. The meeting was set for late afternoon, and as Jake made his way there, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was at stake, something beyond the millions of dollars on the table. The sellers, a middle-aged couple named Thomas and Ellen Parker, welcomed him with a cold politeness. They were clearly used to doing business on their own terms, and they didn't seem particularly eager to make a deal. The conversation began in the typical way, with pleasantries and small talk. Jake tried to engage, but it felt strained. It was as if they were measuring him, deciding whether he was someone worth their time. As the meeting went on, Jake found himself growing more uncomfortable. Thomas Parker was a sharp, calculating man, and Ellen, while quieter, had a presence that seemed to loom over the room. Everything Jake said was met with careful consideration, but little enthusiasm. He realized they were testing him, probing to see if he had the authority to close the deal. It was a game of perception, one that Jake wasn't sure he was prepared for. Sullivan's voice echoed in his mind, "Don't just focus on the numbers. Understand them. But look beyond the deal. People are motivated by more than money." It was then that Jake noticed something subtle. Ellen Parker's eyes flickered to the side when they discussed the financial aspects of the deal. She was tense, but not in the way you might expect from someone negotiating a big transaction. It was as if she had something else on her mind, something personal. Jake decided to probe, but not directly. He shifted the conversation slightly, asking about the history of the property. "I understand this estate has been in your family for generations," he said, his tone casual, almost admiring. "It must be difficult to let it go." Ellen's expression softened at the mention of her family's legacy. Thomas, on the other hand, stiffened slightly but didn't interrupt. It was clear that the mention of their family history carried weight for them. Ellen sighed, looking down at her hands. "It's not easy," she said quietly. "This property represents more than just wealth for us. It's about memories, about who we were, and who we've become. Sometimes, letting go feels like you're erasing part of yourself." Jake's heart clenched. He could feel the vulnerability in her words. And he understood it. Perhaps more than he realized. He didn't need to be a financial expert to recognize that the Parkers weren't just selling an estate, they were parting with something that held deep personal significance. He saw an opportunity, but it was not a conventional one. He leaned forward slightly, his voice softening. "I understand more than you know," he said. "It's hard to move on from the things that have shaped you. But sometimes, holding on too long can prevent you from embracing what comes next. The future can be just as meaningful, in its own way." Ellen looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and surprise. She wasn't used to hearing someone speak so honestly, so empathetically. Thomas remained silent. but the tension in his shoulders eased just a fraction. For a long moment, no one spoke. Jake allowed the silence to hang between them, not out of discomfort but out of respect for what had been said. It wasn't about the deal anymore. It was about understanding what the Parkers needed, what they feared. Jake realized that if they were to sell, it wouldn't just be for money. It would be for a sense of peace, a chance to move forward without feeling like they were losing everything. When the conversation resumed, it was different. There was still negotiation, of course, but it was no longer a battle. It felt like a mutual understanding had been reached. The Parkers weren't just selling property. They were choosing to pass on a part of their legacy. And in doing so, they needed to feel that it was going to someone who respected that history. By the time the meeting ended, the terms of the deal had been largely agreed upon. The Parkers were still cautious, but there was a sense of closure in their demeanor. As Jake walked out of the estate, he felt a shift within himself. For the first time, he had truly understood the human element of business. It wasn't just about the numbers or the deal. It was about recognizing what people cared about, what they needed, and finding a way to meet them halfway. That evening, Jake reported back to Sullivan, who listened carefully before giving a thoughtful nod. "You did well, Jake," Sullivan said, his voice rich with approval. "You didn't just close a deal today. You showed them that you understood what mattered. That's power." Jake's heart swelled with something unexpected, a sense of accomplishment not from the transaction itself but from the deeper connection he'd forged with the Parkers. It was a quiet victory, but it was enough to remind him that, in the end, people were at the heart of everything. As the days passed, Jake's understanding of the world around him deepened. He no longer saw business transactions as mere exchanges of money or property, but as intricate dances of human emotion, where every step, every word, held weight. He learned that true success wasn't just about making deals or climbing the ladder, it was about making meaningful connections, understanding the complexities of others, and using that understanding to create something lasting. With every challenge he faced, Jake grew more confident in his ability to navigate the delicate balance between empathy and ambition. The world of power, money, and influence no longer felt so foreign to him. It felt like something he could mold, something that could be used for good, if only he stayed true to the lessons he had learned along the way. As he sat back one evening, reflecting on how far he'd come, he couldn't help but smile. Life had taught him the most valuable lesson of all, that the true currency of this world wasn't wealth, but the connections we make with others. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more life stories that inspire and resonate.